Hey, welcome back. Now that we're done seeing all the basics of the render tree, the material manager, and all that introduction basic stuff, we're going to start to get our hands dirty and start to work on actual projects. Now, the first project we're going to work on is the desert scene project, simple scene that I set up specifically for this tutorial to show you how to set up materials and shaders pretty efficiently in XSI. So, let's do that. Let's open up the scene that I set up for you, and it's going to be called desert_start. So let's open that up. And it's a pretty simple scene. What we have is a little hill here, ground. We have some rocks, different sizes and shapes. We also have this sort of old tin can just laying here in the dirt. And we also have some old weathered and pretty damaged wooden fence poles here, some old fence that used to be here years ago, who knows when or who knows where. That's really not important. What's important is that we set this up to render correctly, because if we render a preview, this is what we have. Pretty simple scene, the modeling's done, the lighting's done. The problem is the materials and shaders are not done. That's where we come in. See, some other guys sent us this to go ahead and set up the materials. Who sent us this? We'll probably never know. But the point is, we have to go ahead and set up the materials for this to get this to render appropriately. So let's go ahead and close that render region. Now, the main tool we're going to use for this is the material manager. So if we hit Control 7, we'll open up the material manager. Here we are. Now, the only material in our scene right now is this default scene material, which is just a simple Phong shader, which is very boring and uninteresting. And obviously, we're going to have to set up some more interesting materials and with a little more advanced setup in order to get things to look the way they're supposed to. For example, get wood to look like wood, rocks to look like rocks, etc., etc. So let's get to it. So what we'll do is we'll choose what to start off with first. The first thing I'm going to start off with is probably setting up the wood for these wooden poles, for these wooden fence posts. So let's start to do that so we can get this stuff looking more like wood. Okay, so what we're going to do now is create a totally brand new material inside of the material manager. So go up here to where it says materials and click on create new material. Simple enough, right? Now we have this new material. By default it's a Phong, and the material node itself is called Phong. Now we don't want that. We want to organize ourselves a little bit better here. So let's double click on this node and change the name from Phong. Let's change it to wooden fence pole. And wooden fence pole will be just fine. Let's call it matte. I like to put matte at the end. Just a habit I got into a few years ago. I just like to put the word matte at the end for material. You can call it whatever you want though. Okay, so here we have the wooden fence pole material. Now, it still doesn't look like wood, obviously. We only changed the name. This Phong shader just isn't going to be able to get the job done just simply being gray and shiny like that. So what we're going to do is build up a pretty, not a super huge, but a pretty good sized shader network to control the way that this wood's supposed to look like. And we're going to do that by plugging different nodes together. And if we go over here to nodes, you'll see we have tons of nodes to use. So we're going to use certain nodes to get the effect that we want. So the first thing we want to do is plug a texture into this Phong node here. That way it doesn't look gray anymore, but instead looks more like wood. So to do that, it's pretty simple. Let's go up here to nodes. Let's go to texture and let's click on image. And you notice it creates these two brand new nodes, an image node and this other node that actually contains the image itself. Now by default, the image that XSI uses is this sort of checkerboard type grid texture, and that's obviously not what we want to use because that doesn't look like wood. So we need to plug in wood. Now I'm going to take this image node and I have to plug this image node into the Phong node. So I'm going to click on this red dot here, and when I click and drag, I can drag this arrow icon that I can plug into several things. I could plug it here, I could plug it there, I could plug it, well, anywhere where XSI allows me to, which is a lot of places. I want to plug it into this Phong node. So I'll plug it in there, and when I let go of the little icon on top of the Phong node, when it highlights, I'm going to get this submenu, which basically is exercise way of saying, okay, buddy, where do you want to plug that arrow to? Now I can plug it into many different things. As you can see, some of these things are grayed out, but some of them are not. The ones that are not grayed out are places or ports that I could plug that image node into. Now, I don't want to plug that image node, say, into the shininess or the bump or transparency or anything like that. I want to plug it into the diffuse port right here. And the diffuse is what determines the surface color of that object. So I'll click on diffuse, and now you see there's this red arrow that goes from the outside port, or the output port here of the image node, into the diffuse port of the Phong node. And you'll notice here in the little shader ball preview, it changed. So we can clearly see how the material changed here in the little shader ball preview. But it's using the wrong image. It's using this image here, which we don't need. We need to plug in an image that looks like wood. So that's what we need to do next. Double click on the image node here to open up its PPG, and we need to select a new image. So click on new, and click on new from file. And that's going to open up this browser here so that you can look for the image that you need. Now the image we're looking for is going to be in the pictures directory of the project folder that comes with this tutorial. So just go down and look for wooden fence pole underscore color. So here's all the wooden fence pole materials down here. The one that we want is this wooden fence pole color .jpg. So it's a JPEG image. So click on OK. As you can see, it's a wooden texture that was created specifically for this use. Okay, so now hit F6 on the keyboard here over the render tree to go ahead and update this. Alright, so we have this wooden texture going into this image node, which in turn plugs into the diffuse slot of the Phong here. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is we need to apply this material, this new wooden fence pole material. We need to apply it to the wooden fence pole. So let's go ahead and let's select this wooden fence pole here and hold down shift and select this other wooden fence pole. We're not going to select these two that connect the two together. That's going to use a different material. So with these two selected, let's go back to the material manager, right click on top of the wooden fence pole material, and then click on assign to selection. And now those two objects have this new material assigned to them. So we can see in our viewport here, just make sure that you're in a textured view shading mode, so and you'll be able to see the wooden texture on these wooden fence poles. If we hold down Q to do some render regions here, we can see it starts to look more like wood, but it's still not looking too great. We need to obviously make some more adjustments to this. So that's what we're going to do. So let's go back here to this material. So you can see now that our material network here is comprised of a couple of more nodes, the image node and the actual image itself. Well, we got to make this a little bit more complex. What we need to do is add a few more things together. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to apply a bump map to this material. So how do we do that? Let's go to nodes, let's go down to bump, and let's grab ourselves a bump map generator. And now we have this new bump map generator node as well as an image that goes plugged into it. Let's take this yellow dot, click and drag, and we want to plug that straight into this material node here. When it does that, it's going to ask us where we want to plug this to. Well, we want to plug it to the bump map slot. So go ahead and click on that, and now this bump map is connected to it, but it's the wrong bump map. We don't want this image to be the bump map image used for this wooden fence pole, obviously. So what we want to do is double click on the bump map generator node. Then we're going to go up here to new, from file, and what we need to do is find the bump map that's supposed to go connected here. Now it's going to be an image with the same name, wooden fence pole, except it's going to be underscore bump, and we're looking for a JPEG. So let's go ahead and open this one up. There it is. The bump map is simply a black and white sort of height scale image that is going to define which areas are bumpier than others. And also what we want to change here is the factor. This factor parameter is very important because it's going to determine the strength of that bump effect on the surface of this wooden fence pole or whatever object it is that you're working with. Okay, now what you want to do is set this to a negative factor. So we don't want it to be a positive 5 because that's not going to give us the effect that we want. What we want to do is give it less of an effect. We don't want the bump effect to be too strong. So we want to use something like 2, but we want to use -2. The reason we want to use -2 is because positive values are actually going to invert the way that this black and white image is interpreted. The way it's interpreted is the lighter parts of the lighter grays are areas that are sticking out more toward you. Parts that are darker, like black or really dark gray, are crevices and holes in the model. Not exactly holes, but crevices and sort of indents in the object. So things like in between the wood grains, which will be little holes where you can probably stick your fingernail in. Those areas are defined by the darker colors of the grayscale image. So let's go ahead and close this. So now we have the correct image plugged in. Let's hit F6 to clean this up. There we go. So now we have the bump map generator in there and working. Let's go ahead and let's zoom in here and let's get a little bit closer to this wooden fence pole, this one right here. Let's do some render regions here to see what exactly it is that we're getting. Well, let's actually zoom out a little bit more here. See this a little bit better. So now we can see that the wooden textures there, the bump map is having a very good effect. If we go over here to the bump map generator, we can see if we disable bump by unchecking this, we'll see what we get. Here is the texture or the material without bump mapping. You can see the wood, it doesn't look very detailed, looks very bland. As soon as we enable the bump mapping, it gets a lot more interesting. You can see it's got this bumpy effect to it, which makes it look more like the way that it would in real life. So it makes sense to use bump maps whenever possible. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to continue to basically complicate things here with this shader network. Right now it's too simple and it's not going to achieve the effects that we need it to be able to achieve. Okay, so what we're going to do is a few things here. Let's open up this Fong node here by double clicking on it and opening up its PPG, specular. Now we don't want this wood to be specular. The only reason that the wood would have any specularity is if perhaps if it were wet or if it had something like a coating of varnish painted on it. In this case, this is old wood that's out in the desert. It's not going to be wet and it's obviously not going to have any nice clean varnish painted on it. So what we want to do is disable this specularity altogether in order to make this look more like the rough wood that it's supposed to look like. So let's close that and let's see what happened when we turned off specularity. Okay, it's a little bit difficult to see the effect here, but it does help to make the wood look more like the final wood is supposed to look like, because we don't want that specular on there. Nope, we definitely don't. Okay, so the next thing to do is I'm going to complicate this a little bit more. Now, in order to make this look a lot better, we're going to have to go ahead and plug in some different nodes here and make this into more of a complex shader network. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use different nodes to composite different effects together to get a final look to the wood that I'm going after. Now, as you can see, there are tons and tons of nodes that we can use. In this case, the node that I'm going to use, I'm going to go down here to the mixers section of nodes and I'm going to grab the mix 2 colors. And this is a sort of compositing node that you can use to composite different things together. And if you're familiar with working with programs like Photoshop or After Effects or any type of program where you composite different layers of images on top of each other, then this mixer node is going to make a lot of sense to you. If you don't have experience with any programs or don't have a background in anything that has to do with compositing, don't worry, because that's what this tutorial is for. I'm going to show you how to use this mixer node. Now this mix 2 colors node basically has a few parameters here. What this does it can take several layers and composite them, well in this case 2 layers, and composite them on top of each other in a multitude of ways that we need it to. So obviously that probably doesn't make much sense. So let me put it to work, and in practice you'll get to see what's going to happen here. Okay, what I want is I want this Phong node to connect into the Mix Two Colors node. So let's take its output node here, the little red arrow, and let's plug it into the Mix Two Colors, and we want to plug it into the base color. So the Phong node is going to determine the base color of this mixer node. We need to plug something else into this color slot here of the mix layer. What we're going to plug in there is actually a node that we don't have right here. We're going to have to go bring it up. We want to go ahead and go to nodes, go to illumination. You're going to see a node called Ambient Occlusion. So what is Ambient Occlusion? Well, we can spend the rest of the time here talking about Ambient Occlusion and how it works in CG and so on and so forth. Really, that's not the purpose of this tutorial. If you want to learn more about Ambient Occlusion, I suggest doing a Google search of Ambient Occlusion, and you can see some interesting papers and different research about Ambient Occlusion and how it applies to the world of CG. In this case, I'm going to give you the quick explanation of what Ambient Occlusion is. Ambient Occlusion allows you to create an effect that simulates a similar effect that happens in the real world. When two objects in the real world are really close to each other, they occlude light. That is to say, they block light from reaching each other. And you can see this effect pretty simple. If you take your hands, I'm going to assume that you have plenty of light wherever it is that you're working on right now. If you don't, turn on the light. If you put your hands close to each other, the closer your hands get to each other, the darker the surfaces on the inside of your hands look. That's because less light is able to reach the surfaces of your hands, of the palm of your hands. This is a natural effect that happens in the real world, and the Ambient Occlusion node helps to mimic that effect in CG. So that's what we're going to do with this Ambient Occlusion node. We're going to use it to add more realism to our scene by darkening parts up that are supposed to be dark, while at the same time leaving areas that are supposed to be light, leaving them light. So we're going to take this Ambient Occlusion node and we're going to plug it into this Mix Two Colors node, and we want to plug it into the Color 1 slot. So now if we open up the Mixer node, we can see here we have the Phong material, the Phong shaders going into the base color, and the Ambient Occlusion node is going into the mixer color here. Then we have this weight parameter. What we want to do with this weight parameter is make it all the way to white. So it has a value of 1. It's pure white. Now, the way that we mix these together, we're not going to use the mix mode to mix them together. We're actually going to use this hide reveal multiply mode. So it's actually called multiply in most software. So if you're used to working with multiply in, say, Photoshop or After Effects or any other program that uses that compositing mode, this is the same exact mode here in XSI. So you'll see multiply in parentheses. Okay, that's all we want to do. Let's close that node up. Now we need to go ahead and plug this Mix Two Colors node into something. So what we want to do is take this and plug it over here into the surface, shadow, and the photon ports of our material node. So hold down Shift. That way you can select on surface, shadow, and photon. And what that did was it replaced the connections that were coming from the Phong node with the connections that are coming from the mixer node straight into this material node here. Now let's open up the Ambient Occlusion node here because we have to change some parameters around to achieve the effect that we're trying to achieve. Okay? Now the default bright color and dark color are fine. What this means is that at the brightest this will be left alone at white, and at the darkest this can become pitch black or very, very dark. Okay? Now right here we really don't have any other settings to change. I just want to show you these settings really quick. The spread is just going to control the spread of the darkness, and that's of the Ambient Occlusion effect. The maximum distance controls the distance at which the Ambient Occlusion effect occurs. In this case, we're not going to affect the distance. When it's set at 0, that basically turns that parameter off, and the distance will be computed in your actual scene, as opposed to if you change this. So if you change this to say 4, the Ambient Occlusion is only going to reach to a distance of 4, and anything outside that distance will be ignored. So we want to leave it at 0. So let's close that. Now let's go ahead and double click here on Material Manager to the name bar here, just to collapse that and tuck it out of the way. Now let's do a render region of this and see how it looks. Now that looks a lot better. You'll notice that it's a little bit darker now. These areas are not blown out white like they were before. That's because the ambient occlusion effect is, well, it's going into effect. Now, we won't see the ambient occlusion effect in its full glory until we do a render of an area like this where there's a hole. For example, here in a wooden fence, we can see there's a hole here that this other piece of wood kind of just sticks right through. Well, let me show you something. Let's go over here back to the Material Manager. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this ambient occlusion node. I'm going to set the maximum distance to 0.1, which is going to essentially cancel the effect out, which is what I want to do. So by doing that, watch what happens when I do a render region. You'll notice that it looks like it did before we added the ambient occlusion node. Now let's set the distance to 0 to activate it and watch the difference. That is a huge difference right there. That adds more realism, because in real life the light from the sun wouldn't be able to really get really well into those dark crevices and places, so it'd actually be pretty dark. And you can see underneath the wooden stump that kind of goes into the wooden fence pole, you can see it gets really dark right here because it's closer to the object. Just like when I told you to put your palms together and see how they get darker. Well, it's the same effect here. So ambient occlusion works to add more depth, more detail, and more realism to your scenes. So I suggest you use it whenever possible. Okay, now I want to add more detail to this because I don't like the way that the wood looks. The wood looks too clean and too bright, even with the ambient occlusion. So how can I add a little bit more detail? Well, I'm going to use something called a cavity map to do that, and I'm going to composite that cavity map on top of the shader network that we already have, using again the mixer node here, or the mix to colors node. So how are we going to do that? Well, it's pretty simple. We're going to go here to nodes, we're going to go down to mixers, and we're going to pull up another mix to colors node. And what's going to happen is that this mix to colors node is going to plug right into this mix to colors node. So we can actually combine multiple mixer nodes together. So you can start to see, and we want to plug this into the base color, by the way. And now what we want to do is take this this mixer node, and we're going to plug it into this material node. So hold down shift. We're going to replace all the old connections with this new mixer node. Now you can see the shader turn blue. Don't be afraid. The reason that happened is because by default the mixer node is going to have this mix layer color set to blue, but we're going to be changing that in a bit. So you can start to see how you can plug and create these huge networks of different types of nodes together to achieve different effects. That's where the power of exercise render tree really starts to show its strength. The fact that you can take all these nodes and create so many different effects with it is just simply staggering and unbelievable. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to bring in a cavity map, which is simply an image. So let's go to nodes, texture, image. So here is our new image node. Obviously we don't want this default picture. So double click on the image node, click on new from file, and what we want to look for is a file called wooden fence pole underscore cav map. So here it is. Let's open it up. Okay, so we can see here what this looks like. Now to get a better look at that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Alt and 6 to open up an image clip viewer. I'm going to go to clips, and I'm going to click on wooden fence pole cav map so we can see this better, because I want to really show you what's going on here. Here's the wood texture. Now you can see it's a black and white image, and it has a lot of contrast. Now what's going to happen is these dark areas where the grain of the wood is are going to be darkened and look dirtier on the wood when we render it out using this cavity map. This adds more realism and more detail to your texturing and to your shaders, and really does add that extra oomph, that extra kick that you need to make things look better. Okay, now the white areas are going to be left untouched, so the areas that look really bright white are actually not going to really be affected by this cavity map. And if you're asking how I created the cavity map was actually created using the textures that I already had and some editing in Photoshop. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to connect the image node from the cavity map into this mixer node. So let's go ahead and drag and drop that in there and connect it to the color one. And that's going to add that in there. Now let's double click to open up the PPG for the mixer node. We have to make some changes here. Now the changes we want to make are we want to take the weight here, the color of the weight, and put it all the way to white. Close that. And we want to change the mix node again to multiply just with the ambient occlusion node. So close that. Now the preview is going to show up black. That's okay. That's not a problem. Everything's working fine. Let's hit F6 on the keyboard to reorganize this and clean up this shader network. Now you can see it's starting to become more complex. It's really a far cry from where we started, where it was just this material node and a single Phong node connected to it. Now we're starting to get something more interesting and a little bit more complex. So now let's come in here and get a little bit close here and do a render region of this area here. And now you're going to notice that the wood looks totally different. As you can see, the wood now looks dirtier. It looks more realistic. The areas of the wood grain where you can stick, say, small coin or your fingernail now look dirty the way that they're supposed to. And this helps to sell the effect of making this look like it's old, beat up, weathered wood that's been sitting out there outside getting bombarded by the natural elements, wind and rain and the sun for years. So now this looks great. Looks much better than the way that it looked before. Looks very worn out. Looks very dirty. Looks very nasty. And this is a technique that you can use in production if you want to get some texturing done. So this helps to make things look better overall. So let's look again at this shader network. The shader network isn't too complex, although it is more complex than what you would normally expect from a standard little shader network. So you don't want to have just a Phong with a texture plugged in and a bump map and that's it. You want to get creative and you want to go ahead and explore your possibilities with using different nodes together to achieve different effects. So this is an effect that I learned after using XSI, and working with shading for years. I picked this up, just went in there, explored one day, and looked and see how I can make my textures look more realistic, and now I'm passing that knowledge on to you. So you can see our shader network, just to recap, is pretty simple. We have the material node that everything plugs into. We have a bump node with a bump image plugged into it, which is plugged into the material node. Then we have this Phong shader which has the diffuse color plugged into it, and that's being used alongside with an ambient occlusion node to add more realism to the shadows. And that's plugging into a mix two colors node which composites the two together to get a better effect. And then just to put the icing on the cake, we add a cavity map with another mixer node to composite the result of putting these two together along with the cavity map, which just slaps everything together, basically like a sandwich of nice tasty shaders, which are going to go obviously into our material node and give us the final look. So that does it for this shader network for setting up the wooden fence poles. I'm going to stop this video here. I purposely took a pretty long time to explain how to put that shader network together because it's probably your first shader network, at least during this tutorial. So I wanted to go nice and slow and in detail and explain why it is that we're doing things the way that we're doing, because I don't just want to start plugging things in at random, or well, to you it'll seem like it's random, and then you really won't understand what in the world happened. And the whole purpose of this is to show you how to plug these things together and why it is that we're plugging in, say, this mixer node here with a cavity map, why we're plugging in this bump map here, and so on and so forth. So I hope you learned a lot from this video, and I hope you start to understand exactly the power of the render tree and start to see its incredible potential. So that's looking great, by the way. Okay, so in the next video we're going to start to set up the shader networks for the other objects. We still have about 4 other shader networks to set up, so we have a little bit ways to go. and we'll do that in the next video. I'm going to go a little bit faster because if not, it's going to get very tedious and very boring for you if I'm sitting here explaining too much. I'll only stop to explain any new nodes. So if I'm using mixer nodes, for example, you're going to see me go through it a little bit quicker. But if I bring in a new node, like say for displacement or for something else, I'm going to stop and explain to you how that works and why it is that I'm doing what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here, and I'll see you in the next one where we'll pick up and continue where we left off.